Okay, I'm calling the August 10th, 2022 meeting of the Manitou Springs Planning Commission to order. So I'll start by calling the roll. Commissioner Armstrong, Commissioner Storm,
Here.
Commissioner Wilson,
Present.
Commissioner Casey,
Present.
Commissioner Latimer,
Present.
Commissioner Graybill.
Here.
Okay. Next item of business is, and I'm Commissioner Delwich. Next item of business is approval of the minutes of the July 13th, 2022 regular meeting.
Motion to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any additions or corrections? I guess not. So all those in favor, raise your hand. That's 6 with one abstention. Commissioner Armstrong was not there, so he won't be voting. So we will move on to the business part of our meeting. I'll start by describing the process. I'll call an item for consideration. Planning staff will describe the applicant's request and provide their analysis and findings based on the applicant's application. Following that, the application will have an opportunity to state their case and provide any additional information if they wish to provide the commission. And through this process, the planning commissioners may ask questions of staff or the applicant. After the commission is finished with their questions, the hearing will be open for public comment from those in the attendance. At that time, if you wish, you would be able to state your thoughts regarding the item under consideration. After all public comment has been heard, the chair will close the public comment portion of the hearing, and commissioners will deliberate and act on the item under consideration by voting to support or deny the item or may table the item. As the commission deliberates, they'll be guided by the zoning and subdivision codes. And we make our decision based only on our interpretation of whether the request meets the criteria in the codes. So before we start, are there any conflicts or ex parte conversations to disclose? Okay, I see none. So the first item of new business is variance 2207, front yard setback 6 feet where 10 feet is the minimum, 825 Chipeta Road. Brian Heidmus, applicant.
Thank you. For the record, this is Chelsea Stromberg, senior planner. V 2207 at 825 Chipeta Road is a variance request to reduce the front yard setback to 6 feet where 10 feet is the minimum. The zone district is general residential. The applicant is requesting a variance to reduce the front yard setback in order to construct an attached porch, which would also serve as a carport. The proposed porch would be set back approximately 6 feet from the property line and would be constructed the entire width of the principal structure and would not encroach into the side yard setbacks. Here's a site plan of the proposed structure. The proposed carport is in red at the northeast side of the property. You can see it's set back just a little over 6 feet on the southeastern side and a little more than that. It's an asymmetrical structure. The applicant, findings and review criteria for variances state that no variance shall be authorized unless all of the following criteria have been met. Number one, the applicant would suffer a hardship as a result of the application of the code. The principal structure was constructed in 1980 on a lot that is 2,625 square feet, which is smaller than the currently required 4,400 square feet. Also, due to the steep topography and the limited size of the lot, the front of the house is the only viable place to build a porch. Number two, there are no design alternatives. The principal structure is built to the side yard setbacks and the rear yard already has a deck as well as that steep topography. There are no design alternatives that would not result in a variance. Number three, enforcement of the provision of the code deprives the applicant of rights enjoyed by a majority of other properties in the same zone district. Front porches are prominent in most zone districts in Manitou Springs, and the two adjacent residences have similarly situated porches. 821 Chipeta Road was granted a variance to the front yard setback by V 1210, 8 feet where 10 feet is the minimum. And the porch at 823 Chipeta Road was approved administratively by complying with the 10-foot setback. On the screen are images of those two porches. The applicant has stated that he intends to build a porch that is very similar to these two. Criteria number 4, the need for variance is not self-imposed. Though the applicant desires to build the porch, the location of the porch is not due to any actions of the applicant. The principal structure was constructed closer to the road due to the steep topography of the site, which limits the ability of the applicant to construct a porch of a reasonably usable around the site. Number 5, reasonable protections are afforded adjacent properties. The variance would not jeopardize or infringe upon the rights of adjacent properties. Number 6, the requested variance will not cause an undesirable change in the character of the neighborhood, result in development of areas at risk of natural hazards, or have an adverse effect on the physical or environmental conditions of the surrounding property. The requested variance would bring more continuity to the neighborhood, as this is the only one of 3 nearly identical houses that does not have a front porch extending over the driveway. Constructing the porch over the driveway negates potential natural hazards, as the driveway is already secured with retaining walls. Granting of the variance will observe the spirit of the code, secure the public safety and welfare, and ensure that substantial justice is done. The location of the porch, proposed porch, maintains the spirit of the code, as it allows for all intentions behind setbacks to be met, in that setbacks are typically enforced in order to allow for light and air to reach adjacent properties, as well as allow for the maintenance of the structure without trespassing. This proposed porch will not jeopardize public safety and welfare, and granting this variance will enable the applicant to construct a porch similar to those enjoyed by their immediate neighbors. Should the Planning Commission find it appropriate to grant the requested variance, staff recommends the following conditions. Number 1, the applicant shall obtain a building permit prior to construction of the porch. And number 2, the porch shall not be constructed with a roof. On the screen are proposed motion language options. And this concludes my presentation.
Any questions for staff? Okay.
Alan, I have a question.
Yes.
When we talked at the end of last meeting about how we were presenting, one of the things that Commissioner Reagan pointed out was that we were always doing pros, and we suggested that we go with pros and cons of how it meets the criteria. But in this situation, there are only pros. So does that mean there were no cons about meeting the criteria?
We do feel that the proposed porch does meet the criteria for a variance.
100%. No possible cons. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. The applicant could step to the table and state your name and address for the record.
My name is Brian Heidmas, and my address is 825 Chipeta Road, Manitou Springs, 80829.
Okay. Well, you've heard the staff recommendations. Are you comfortable with it? And do you have anything else you'd like to add to the record?
I appreciate being able to make the application to, at this point, build a deck that is similar to our neighbors, given the changes.
Any questions for the applicant?
Do you know the depth of the neighbor's deck at 821?
I measured it to be 10 feet, 10 inches to the fascia board, not to the post face. So I have a similar deck dimension on my plan.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions? Okay, well, if you have nothing more to add, then you can step away, and
Thank
if we have more questions for you, we'll bring you back.
Appreciate that.
So now the hearing's open to the public. If anybody would like to comment on it, now's the time. And seeing no comments, close the public comment portion of the hearing, and we're at the table to deliberate.
Helen, can I just clarify, there were no public emails, nothing about this application?
No, we received no public comment.
Okay, this would be a good time if someone would like to make a motion.
Go ahead. Well, I'll make a motion to approve variance 2207. Front yard setback 6 feet where 10 feet is the minimum, 825 feet of road. With staff's 2 conditions.
Second. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any more discussion? Seeing none, then all in favor can signify by raising your hand. Okay, that motion carries unanimously. So that's it. Okay,
Alan, may I ask a question?
sure.
And I'm probably betraying my ignorance here, but when I went up to look at the property, I thought, why is this coming before planning commission? Both neighbors have similar decks. Why is that not possible to take care of something so obvious as this with administratively?
Thank you, Commissioner Armstrong, for that question. That's a great lead into the next presentation, because that's exactly this type of stuff that we've been talking about with the zoning code update. So if we could move forward to that item, then we could talk about options for variances, which is something we've been talking about frequently.
Okay, with that introduction, we'll move on to other business.
All right. Thank you, Chair Delwich. For the record, Hannah Van Nimwegen McGuire, the City Planning Director for City of Manitou Springs. And today I wanted to give a brief update on the work that we've been doing with the Land Use and Development Code update. So today is just an informational update. There's nothing that is formally in front of you. There's no motions to be made, but we are seeking feedback or advice or potential things that you would like to see during a formal hearing. Right now, if everything goes according to plan, which there's still time for things to go askew, we would be bringing the formal code in front of the City Planning Commission for the October hearing. And we are anticipating being able to provide the commission the draft ordinance or the draft code 3 weeks in advance of that meeting. So there would be 3 weeks to review 7 chapters of a revised ordinance, and we should have an executive summary of the changes as well as a red line for the commission's review at that time. But for today, I really just wanted to update on the topics we've been discussing and hear general feedback on potential directions that we can discuss with our code committee and go from there. So first off, I wanted to show where we are. And in this machine that we've been working on, there's 3 primary stages, in my opinion. There's the initial input and idea stage, then we start drafting language, and then we go into the adoption process. And that adoption process includes a recommendation by the City Planning Commission, as well as 2 hearings with the City Council. Right now, we're anticipating a work session with the City Council, so it'd be very similar to what we're doing today. But then we would go to first reading and then second reading, and then that would be the formal date of adoption with an effective date, likely January 1st of 2023. So at this stage, I'd say that we are soon to be in the adoption process. As of late very late or very early this morning, the draft ordinance was submitted to our code committee to start their 3-week review. So some of the topics that I'm going to talk about today, they are subject to change until we go through the code committee review. We'll have a public review period and public comment period, then before the city planning commission, and then before the city council. So there's still a lot of time to make adjustments and for things to change, but this is the general direction that we're headed at this stage. So overall, this new code streamlines code sections, removes duplicative language, and reorganizes Title 16, which is the existing subdivision code, Title 18, which is the zoning code, and Chapter 15.16, which is the sign code, into just one title, which would be Title 18. We are, as part of this, we are working on establishing clear procedural steps for each application type in this updated zoning code. And I'll go through that when we get to that chapter. This new code also expands and identifies the powers of the neighborhood services officer. So that's essentially the code enforcement officer. Right now, that section doesn't have a whole lot of teeth or power, and it's not really clear what their tools are. So we've expanded and outlined those as well. We are also establishing general architectural standards. And overall, one of the primary themes is supporting preservation and supporting natural features and preservation and protecting the environment as much as possible. So we are proposing 7 chapters altogether. So chapter 1 would be similar to what you currently have or what we're currently working with. That's general provisions. This generally outlines authority of the zoning code, how it interacts with the comprehensive plan, and a few other things. Chapter 2, it outlines the zone districts. We are largely carrying forward all of the existing zone districts, except introducing one new one, which would be the mixed use district. Chapter 3 is development standards. So that's everything between architectural requirements to landscaping, to exterior lighting, to walls and fences, and many more things that I can't think of off the top of my head. Chapter 4 is where we regulate use. So that's where the permitted land use table is, as well as any additional standards that are applicable to specific uses. Chapter 5 is the specifics of subdividing land and platting land. Chapter 6 is that procedures that we just talked about, and Chapter 7 is definitions. So overall, Chapter 1 covers the purpose, intent, applicability, and authority of this new LUDC, so Land Use and Development Code. It also establishes review and decision-making bodies, and it addresses non-conforming lots, structures, and land uses. So this includes discontinuance of a land use and damaged structures. We had a discussion on no item in particular a few months ago about if non-conforming structures that were burned down, if there ever was a sunset on their legal non-conforming status, and the current code does not have a timeline on that. The new code does. So we do outline a sunset for when a structure is damaged and when somebody would need to come in and pull a building permit in order to maintain that legal non-conforming status. Chapter 2 carries forward the existing zone districts and creates a new mixed use zone district. So the mixed use zone district is really intended for the eastern gateway of Manitou Springs and is very similar to the redevelopment overlay. We are not intending to carry forward the redevelopment overlay. The new zone district covers most of those components that the overlay would have regulated. This chapter also outlines setbacks, building height, lot coverage, and maximum densities. In this chapter, we also outline a 25% density bonus if 25% or more of residential units are rented or sold at a price that is affordable to a household earning 100% of the area median income. So we did put together, or the code committee did have a subcommittee which researched how to approach housing in our zoning code. And this was something that we are partially carrying forward from the existing code with some adjustments based on recommendations from that subcommittee. Chapter 3 is when we really start getting into the meat of things. So Chapter 3 really regulates how things look in Manitou Springs. So first, I wanted to touch on commercial architecture. So most of this language is going to be brand new to Manitou Springs. And again, we can always shift direction, but this is what we have vetted with the code committee and think would work for the city. So we are proposing that at least 30% of a building facade on the ground level and the street facing facade is covered in windows. So that adds a little bit of a, or it helps avoid that blank wall that's right up on the street where people might be walking and driving and things like that. We are also proposing that within 20 feet of the right of way, buildings cannot exceed 28 feet in height. And then they must, or I should say, at the 28-foot level, they have to step the building back 10 feet up to their maximum building height of 35 feet. And this would apply again in those commercial and mixed use zone districts. So right up at the setback line, which would be 10 feet, you could go up 28 feet, then you have to step it back. And I have an illustration on the next slide of what that looks like. Also, buildings over 50 feet in length have to have a facade variation where that facade has to step back from that setback line. And again, that just helps prevent that looming feel of a larger structure over the sidewalk or over a roadway. And again, I have an illustration on the next slide of what that could look like. The last thing is in the commercial zone district and mixed use zone district, we're proposing that 4% of the site area has to be dedicated to an outdoor amenity. And that can be something like outdoor dining, outdoor seating, a public art display, or something along those lines. And this is kind of what some of those things might look like. It's hard to visualize text, but this is what we're hoping to get at. Where the first image, and I understand that might be a little bit difficult to see, but that first image on the left shows what a 25-foot, 10-foot setback, and then a third floor could look like. So 28 feet is generally what is required for 2 stories. And so a third story, which could fit within the maximum building height of 35 feet, would have to be 10 feet back from that facade line. The second picture, this is way taller than 35 feet. So definitely don't take the maximum building height into account with this particular picture. But what it's trying to show is what the facade articulation could look like, where you have a roughly 65% right up on the setback line, and then a requirement to set the rest of the structure back 10 additional feet. So that, again, we're preventing that looming feeling right up on that setback line. Before I move into landscaping, I just want to double check if anybody has any comments or questions about general architecture for commercial districts. Yeah.
Is there an idea of how many structures right now would, they don't have to comply, I understand, but how many structures would actually fit into this proposed guidelines?
Thank you, Commissioner Wilson. That's a great question. So I would say, and Chair Dilwich, you might need to help me out, but I would say majority of the structures that exist east of the Highway 24 and Manitou Avenue interchange probably comply with what we're proposing. The one that would not comply would be the new Holiday Inn Express that inspired some of these requirements, because that one is right up on the setback line and it does go straight up 3 stories. So if that structure were to be built under these new sections, they could still have that same maximum height, but they would have to step back those top floors 10 feet and then articulate that building facade or set off that that plane, I guess. So the one, or you would have roughly 60% right at the where it currently is, and the rest of the structure would be set back a little further. So that's the one that comes to mind right now that would not comply.
Are you asking for questions on anything you've discussed so far?
Oh yeah, please.
Just to be clear, the development standards you're referring to are just east to this new zone?
Thank you for that question, Commissioner Casey. So the sorry, the standards that we're discussing right now would apply to any commercial architecture outside of the downtown zone, if I remember right. So that could be east of that interchange, but not until you hit that downtown or until you hit that downtown zone district.
So basically anything east of the downtown.
That's
So
correct.
In the 400 block, 500 block. Oh, okay. Yeah. All right, all right. All right, and then you mentioned the non-conforming lots. And you said a sunset on length of time, a damaged or destroyed structure. Is there a difference between damaged and dilapidated? In other words, there's some homes in the historic district that are just run down to a pulp.
Right.
Is that going to be part of the conversation?
That is a great question, and that may be one that I need to follow up with you on. So in my opinion, a damaged structure or a destroyed structure, we know what a destroyed structure is, like if something burns down and it's completely flattened and raised. A damaged structure would be something that's been damaged over 50% of the existing area or worth of the structure. I'll have to double check the exact language, but a dilapidated structure may not fit in that definition as it's currently written.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I made a note to clarify that.
Well, I mean, the reason why I ask is, that HPC, bless their hearts, they have meetings about, replacing windows and lights. But downtown Manitou, there's homes that are, I don't know if they're abandoned or occupied, but they're just falling down. I mean, I think that should be a focus in the National Historic District.
Which perhaps a good way of looking at that would be looking at maintenance standards for those historically designated structures. You can also apply those maintenance standards more broadly. And what you want to do is kind of have that as your baseline. And then the top line is a nuisance. And so anything in between is okay, but you want to make sure that they're maintaining their property to a certain level. And if it gets really bad, then you can have a nuisance and you can file an action as a city.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Because I think Mike had a great question. I know I have in-law relatives that live on Washington. And they have an 85-year-old lady living in a house that's fallen down around her ears. But I don't think are you talking about only commercial or residential also?
Both.
Because that's going to be a question also, right? What do you do about the residential ones?
If I could clarify it, so that the non-conforming structure provision applies to all structures. So it doesn't matter what the use is, it's all structures. And then tent, and again, like this is something we can clarify in the language, is that it's some sort of natural disaster has occurred, and that's the damage that has been done. So like a fire is the typical example. That slow sort of degradation of a property should probably be got at through maintenance standards. And if it gets really bad, you have other legal options, but through the code, you probably want to get at it through maintenance standards.
And last comment, on the 25% density bonus for affordable housing, I'm sure you guys have gone round and round on that, but what my gut just says 25% seems high. Not the bonus, but the 25% of residential units. Just curious how that number came up?
My understanding is, actually, I'd have to go back and check the existing code because there is a density bonus provision in the existing code, if I'm remembering right. And that might have been a number that's carried forward, but I know Alan, it was on that housing subcommittee.
Yeah, I think that the current density bonus was strictly in the redevelopment overlay, for basically what we call the URA. And I think it's, we batted around in the committee different numbers. And that's, sort of set in mush right now. It could be.
Well, if somebody builds a business and then has 10 rentals above it, how do you do 25% of 10?
Right. I think we would need to round down if it became a fraction at that point.
25% only applied to the amount of residential units if it's, okay. So in that scenario, that commercial part wouldn't be considered in the pie.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I really appreciate feedback like this so that we can help answer questions or make adjustments where we need to at this early-ish stage. So moving on to landscaping. We are proposing landscape requirements that largely are that consist of native or low water usage plantings. We are also working to establish landscape buffers between commercial/industrial land uses and residential land uses. We are also establishing streetscape landscape requirements. So needing a tree of a certain type every 40 linear feet of a property's frontage on a public right of way. We are also working to create parking lot landscape requirements and establish a 10-foot landscape setback. So what that means is from your property line or back of sidewalk in, 10 feet of that needs to be a landscape buffer before you have a parking lot or a structure or anything of that nature. And that would only apply to commercial zoned properties, commercial and mixed use. It would not apply to the downtown district or to residential. Again, we are also, or with that, we are proposing a process, or I think it's in the existing code too, but a process for alternative compliance, where if for whatever reason that requirement really restricts a property from being developed or for potential development, that they could replace that landscaping one for one elsewhere on the property. So we're really not decreasing the amount of landscape area or impervious surfaces. We're just relocating it elsewhere. We are also proposing through alternative compliance that if they were to provide trail access or creek access or something like that, we could reduce that requirement, any of our landscape requirements.
I guess my question on that would be the balancing of parking requirements versus landscape parking requirements. And you could potentially be reducing a great number of parking spaces by requiring the parking landscaping, which is kind of tough.
Right. So everything is a balance. And we are discussing parking currently. And I do have what our current spot is or where we've landed on parking for the time being. And again, this is all could change with feedback. So I think parking might actually be the next one. Oh, it's a couple ahead. But in addition to landscaping, we are also proposing a set of sustainable site incentives or improvements. And that would include with the installation of community gardens or fruit trees with residential or high density residential projects, connections to trails, bicycle parking or bike lockers, electrical vehicle charging, permeable pavement, exceeding the landscape requirements or adding a gray water irrigation system, parking spaces that are under solar reflective cover, or the installation or usage of solar panels, geothermal or solar thermal energy sources. And again, there's a table that's in the code now or in the draft that lists these sustainable site incentives. If they were to meet a certain number or certain threshold, then they could do something else. So it's a way of creating a market to incentivize these in sustainable site installations.
Just one comment on the fruit trees. I love the idea of the fruit trees. Only problem is bears. It's like having a trash can if you have fruit trees. And that's just something you got to think about, that you don't want to have something that's creating an attractive nuisance. That we have a lot of bear activity coming for fruit trees. And in a business district, then to create a issue where you've got the bears coming because of your fruit trees and your, just something to think about.
That is a great point, and I will bring that up. Thank you. Okay, we're moving on to parking. We are proposing a baseline standard for commercial land uses that requires one parking stall per 400 square feet of usable floor area, or whatever that makes sense for a particular land use. So we're proposing this baseline, but then we're also calling out certain land uses that are more intensive or unique, that require unique parking, or that require additional consideration. So a good example is restaurants. Restaurants definitely are more intensive than needing one parking space per 400 square feet. And Barley McDonough, she's on our code committee, and she has helped us identify what an appropriate parking ratio would be for restaurants, bars, things of that nature. So there are certain land uses that will require more than 1 to 400, but general retail and offices would be at that ratio. We are also proposing alternative parking plans, which would allow somebody to provide a parking study that would show us or justify why we should allow a reduction in the parking requirement. And an alternative parking plan could be something where they're partnering with another land use where they're complementary. So let's say a religious institution and a bank. Those tend to have peak hours that are very different. And so it doesn't necessarily make sense in some cases to require the maximum of 2 land uses that maybe can share the same parking area. So we do have some potential alternatives to the parking requirement where it makes sense. We are also proposing potential reductions for affordable housing and historic properties. Affordable housing would still need to have a baseline parking requirement, but if they were located within, I believe, 400 feet of a bus stop, then they could reduce it a certain percentage. We are also proposing a complete exemption for parking requirements in the downtown zone district. Are there any questions regarding parking before we move on? Great. So a couple more things in chapter 3. We are proposing to continue the requirement for geologic hazard reports, but also bring back the requirement for environmental impact statements. And those would be triggered with pretty much any level of new development, so new construction or redevelopment. So we would review a geologic hazard report just like we have been doing. We're not proposing a whole lot of change there. But then in conjunction with a geologic hazard report, we would be talking about or reviewing an environmental impact statement as well. The sign code has also been wrapped into this chapter, and it's pretty much exactly the same as what you approved in 2019. We are just proposing some very minor language cleanups. Moving on to chapter 4, where we start talking about regulating land use. So largely what we've done with this chapter is combine like uses into broader categories. In the existing code, we call out very specific types of retail, very specific types of businesses, and we were able to clump those into broader categories. So for instance, where we might have said a candy and confectionery store and a florist, those are very similar in intensity, and we can just call that a general retail store. So that's how we've approached our land use table, where we don't get into a whole lot of hyper-specific business types, but more those broader categories. We are also introducing temporary and accessory land uses. Some of those may require potentially, if we decide to move forward with a temporary use permit, and accessory land uses, meaning that it's purely tied to an existing primary land use that's permitted in a zone district that has certain standards tied to it. So an example would be outdoor storage. That would be an accessory land use that's tied to a primary land use that has specific development standards tied to it. We are in this chapter also defining land uses and outlining those additional regulations. And we are also discussing short-term rentals in this chapter. Right now, what the Code Committee has proposed, and we think we need to move forward with at this time, is introducing a requirement for short-term rentals to be owner-occupied. And what that would mean is that an owner of a short-term rental that would be approved post this code update would not retroactively apply, would have to live on site at least 185 days of the total year. And all other requirements we are proposing to remain the same.
Can I ask a clarifying question on that one? So they'd have to live on site. So if it's a bedroom apartment, the owner can live on it 180 days a year and then rent it the rest of the year.
That's how we have currently written it, as long as that is their primary address, 185 days of the year. And that would come with an affidavit that would assure that they are doing that.
Okay.
I think one other change that we're talking about is to not have them run with the land.
Thank you, Commissioner Delwich. So we are proposing a short-term rental permit would be the regulating document versus a conditional use. And that short-term rental permit would be approved specific to a property owner and would not run with the land. So if a property owner or an LLC were to change hands, if a property were to be sold, or if an LLC were to be sold, or a personal guarantor of that LLC were to change, that would constitute a change of ownership and a new short-term rental permit would be required. Those short-term rental permits would also need to be renewed annually. This is a process that City of Colorado Springs currently uses and is working relatively well. Again, this would only apply to short-term rentals that are approved post this code adoption. At this stage, we've gotten legal advice that we could not take away the approval of a conditional use, minor conditional use of an existing short-term rental. So all those regulations would remain the same as they were approved under. This would be just for short-term rentals moving forward.
Can you outline the rationale behind a far more restrictive approach to short-term rentals?
So it's been staff's understanding that there's been a community concern of short-term rentals becoming a commercial land use, so to speak. And so this is a way to keep them residential in nature. But again, this is all just where we've landed at this stage.
So are those the two major changes to the ordinance?
Regarding short-term rentals, yes.
Can I get on my soapbox? Just a brief history. Years ago, there was no ordinance, so it was just kind of a free-for-all. So then there was a moratorium, and then we sat around and created the ordinance. And you live and learn. What I think we did was we created a checklist so that if the applicant meets these criteria, it became a rubber stamp almost. It went from one extreme to the other. So it should have really been administratively approved, in my opinion. They come up and they plead their case. But if they met the checklist, we didn't have any input, right? So we kind of lost the ability to look at them on a case by case basis. And I think that needs to be reinstated some way, somehow. Maybe some line as simple as, fire extinguishers, property management, 21 days of income, yada, yada, and the sole approval of the planning commission. Just something so that we can look at them on an individual basis. I'll give you one quick example. There was one on a massive piece of property, like 3 or 4 acres, which is huge. And the 500-foot circle just nicked the corner of this house. They had a building that was separate, been a rental for years. And then they came up here in front of us trying to play by the rules. And because the 500-foot circle just touched that property, they were denied and they sold their house. So that's why I think we were told at the time that we couldn't come up with an ordinance that changed per neighborhoods. So we came up for the whole city that encompasses the whole city, and it's very difficult because downtown Manitou is different than Crystal Hills, for example. So I really think we need to have the ability to look at them on a case-by-case basis and make a decision.
Thank you for that feedback. So the conversation that we've had, and again, this definitely warrants additional conversation, is so with this potential short-term rental permit application, it would remain administrative. However, there would be an appeal process built in. So if there was an individual, whether that was the applicant or a neighbor who disagreed with staff's decision, they would have the right to appeal it up to the City Planning Commission. So there would still be an opportunity for the City Planning Commission to hear a short-term rental application. And again, this is all just where we've landed for the time being. I would caution the City Planning Commission from hearing short-term rental permit applications as we've proposed them, because that would mean that roughly 50, 60-ish applications are coming to you yearly for a review. So we could look at maybe an initial approval comes to the City Planning Commission, and then an annual renewal is administrative. Alan did mention that he had a preference for the City Planning Commission to review short-term rentals as well. And we kind of landed on this potential appeal process. But again, this is discussion we can still have.
Can you say that again, what you said?
Well, what Hannah proposed was that this would become it, because it is, as you said, a checklist.
Right.
There's not a lot of discretion, that it would be administratively approved on an annual basis. Like if you had a short-term rental, you get it approved. Next year, you'd come back for a second, you to renew it. But I articulate kind of what you did, that it's nice to have a planning commission hear these. So what Hannah suggested was instead to have this appeal process. Or, if someone comes up with a new one and people in the neighborhood freak out, they can appeal it.
But I'll get back to the same problem we had when we had that one in Crystal Hills, where the entire neighborhood, blocks of people came in against it. There was nothing we could do about it. So if there's an appeal process that we can't say no to, I mean, having an appeal process like we have now, if it meets the criteria, I mean, as long as we have teeth in an appeal process, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not on board with that at all. A neighbor would have to really follow what's going on. Would there be a public notice? All that kind of stuff. If I recall, short-term rentals are maxed out at something like 52 citywide. So we're not going to get overwhelmed with applications. And I don't mind reviewing them at all. I don't know what anybody else thinks about, but it's a super sensitive topic in Manitou. I deal with this in my life all the time. It's awful. It's so I wouldn't recommend not having the opportunity for public input from the get-go.
Sure. One thing that we'll talk about in a later slide is that we are proposing submittal public notice. Right now, it's really just public notice for a public hearing or for when a minor or a subdivision comes in. So with mostly new application types or most application types, we would be required to submit a public notice or to do a public notice upon application submittal. So that would be something new that we were bringing forward to. So if there would be the opportunity for a neighborhood to know when an application came in shortly after we received it, so they could provide comment.
But I promise my last comment. If you look at the map with all the circles, there is very, very few geographically available properties in the city. Very few. So, if somebody goes to you guys and applies and they're in the green circle land, that will deny the request, I assume, immediately. So we're not going to get a lot of applications. They don't, geographically, there aren't many left. So again, I don't mind.
Especially because they go with the land.
Pardon me?
especially because they go with the land, the ones that have been granted. It's not like those circles are going away.
Well, yeah, but that's a good change. I think that should change just from, yeah. But anyway, I'm done.
Yes.
I promise.
Oh, no, I sincerely appreciate this conversation. So this was one way that I had proposed that we could move away from a short-term rental application running with the land was through a permit process that's tied to a property owner. However, that means that whenever a property owner changes, a new permit is required. And through an annual renewal process, we're able to go through and in some ways clean up short-term rentals that are not being used anymore. Whereas right now with a conditional use, if there was a gap in a short-term rental being utilized that way, as long as it didn't exceed 12 months, somebody else could come in and pick that back up. So that could mean that if we raise the review authority up to the City Planning Commission for short-term rental permits, that you guys would be having roughly 50-ish items being heard, or maybe 60 if there's a lot of property changeover every year. So that's one thing to just be aware of. If we raise that review authority up to the City Planning Commission, there is the potential to be hearing many of these every single year with potentially some repeats.
But not the ones that have already been approved. You're only speaking of ones that are in the future approval, which I think last time we talked about, there were 4 available.
Yes.
So this is a long time in the future where that would happen.
Right. So internally, one of the things that we've been talking about is a annual checkup on those conditional uses so that we could start making sure that if they were to start a discontinuance of a short-term rental use, we would know if that short-term rent or if that conditional use could be in some ways revoked, because a conditional use, if I remember the code correctly, discontinues if that use ceases for a period of 12 months or
Oh,
more.
really?
But
Awesome.
that isn't actively being tracked. So that's something internally that we would need to start doing.
Awesome.
So there is the potential for when we start looking into this, that more areas would open up.
Yeah, we have had a few that actually were approved and then they never implemented it and they just faded away. But, one thing that this conversation triggered that I didn't think about before is something that I'm sure Mike has encountered or realtors have encountered it. When someone has a short-term rental and they go to sell it, the new owner wants to keep that. And we need to, I think, clarify that the fact that the current owner has this permit with this new paradigm, that doesn't necessarily entitle the next owner to it. Because that's the pushback that we're going to get immediately. Someone's going to come with their realtor and the realtor is going to be saying, either you give my client this approval or, we're going to be really mad.
Sorry, I was just going to say that. I don't know how to work around that. On one hand, running with the land probably is not a good idea, but then, it's a huge marketing tool. If somebody's selling a short-term rental, and if the new buyer may not want to run it like that, end of story. But if they do, they're going to want some sort of guarantee that they can continue doing what was done with the previous owner.
In instances like that, we could have basically the two parties in our office at the same time, where one repeal or basically takes back their application and the next property owner submits that same application. So it would be basically a transfer with new information and potentially raising that authority or having to go to a city planning commission hearing if we raise the review authority up to the city planning commission hearing. With City of Colorado Springs, when just as a point of reference, since I have some experience there, but that's what would happen at the front counter frequently. Their short-term rental permits are done administratively. So you would have almost like a closing at the city planning office, so to speak, where somebody's taking back their approval and then somebody else is submitting theirs so they could hold their buffer. So when, let's just say you have somebody who sells their property, they're forfeiting their 500-foot buffer holds, and somebody else could come in and take that buffer area as long as it still met everything. So they would have to come in and basically take one back and apply for a new one at the same time to hold that space.
I'm gonna just ask the neighbor against neighbor question. You know, your neighbor across the street selling their house. You go into the planning commission, you know that they're gonna have to give up their VRBO license. And you've always wanted to have one. And so you go in and to the planning commission and say, planning department say, hey, I want to put my name in line for when they give theirs up. Ooh, who gets it?
Well, there's no, from what I know, it's first come, first serve. There's
Yeah,
no-
so if the neighbor goes in and says
Right. So that's
Yeah,
why
I'm-
maybe we could put something in the ordinance that a new owner of an existing short-term rental gets first dibs within a week. If they don't apply or transfer the license within a week, then they're on their own. But that's a train wreck waiting to happen if that's not addressed.
So if we could play through a scenario, I'm just curious how you guys would react to this. So let's say somebody sells their short-term rental, new owner comes in, they apply for a short-term rental permit, and we're waiting to be heard by the city planning commission. Somebody else, like let's say the next door neighbor still meets all the criteria, they come in and they make an application too. Let's say that applicant one doesn't quite provide us exactly the correct information, but applicant two did. And so we had maybe administratively determined that that influences whether they are appropriate to move forward to city planning commission or not. Is it appropriate to only bring forward applicant two in that particular case, even though applicant one had first dibs?
Well, in your example, it was a house being sold, correct?
Mhm.
Well, I would assume that that house has met all the criteria, been approved. So then it just seamlessly transfers. They don't have to be, I don't even think that would have to go in front of the planning commission if it's existing. That would be administratively approved on the spot.
So
And then, then maybe follow up with the code enforcer or something. They could stop by and check it out or something. But that in your example, I would imagine would not have to go in front of us.
maybe what we could look at doing and have further discussion about is if there's a new location coming in, that new short-term rental, that house has never been used as a short-term rental before, that has to get approved by the city planning commission. And any subsequent annual renewal, as long as there's no changes to the exterior of the structure, no intensity increases or anything like that, that can be an administrative approval.
So what happens when someone gives up, the house sells and the new owner doesn't want to keep it? Then you open up another green zone and it's first come, first serve, or
Yes.
That's the idea, yes.
Yeah, it might,
would
you
that
know-
information be published somehow?
Under the way I envisioned this working, we hadn't thought about doing any type of publication that there's now an open area of the city for short-term rental, that it would be up to somebody's due diligence to keep checking back with us.
And if I can comment, it doesn't have to be a sale. You could own a short-term rental and just change your mind, right? And we put in, getting all excited over it. It's a hot topic.
Yeah.
There's part of the ordinance says you have to prove 21 days of income when you renew. And theoretically, that stops you from getting a license and not doing anything, just keeping it away from your house, right? So if you had a short-term rental and you just got tired of it, you don't have to renew your license, and then it would be open up first come, first serve.
Okay, so this has given us a good amount to think about. So maybe we will go back to the drawing board and on short-term rentals and bring something different forward when you guys actually see the draft code.
May I ask one more question? And this is a very general question. Many of the comments that I have heard while being on the planning commission about short-term rentals have been about concerns about noise, parking, bear-proof containers, fires outside. Will there be something in the code that is a requirement that actually gets enforced? Because now, as I understand it, code enforcement may come, and by the time they get there, maybe that situation is altered or not there. So that's just a concern I often hear. And one of the reasons that some of my friends and neighbors say, you know, we have enough short-term rentals.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Latimer. That's a really good point. So now understanding that that's something that you've been hearing frequently, I'll talk with our code enforcement or neighborhood services officer as to what her current process is and see if we can adjust it from there. Regarding the code, where there's existing ordinances regarding noise or bear-proof cans or something like that, we wouldn't be changing anything. So it would be a matter of enforcing what we have, which we can definitely step up on.
Okay, that makes sense.
And if I can add, there is a link on the website that you can complain about short-term rentals, but very, very, very few people know about that.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know we had that. So
Oh,
thank
there
you
you
for
go.
telling me. Okay. So chugging on along to chapter 5, this is a very technical chapter. So we're talking about subdivision regulations and when you're technically allowed to subdivide land, plat land, and what that needs to look like. So this carries forward the requirements for mandatory public improvements that are triggered by a subdivision or platting of land. That includes installation of sidewalk, curb, and gutter, as well as drainage facilities. We are also expanding the process and language regarding financially guaranteeing the installation of those improvements. Right now, there is a section of code that allows us to get these financial assurances, but it's a little bit wishy-washy. And so the proposed ordinance really nails down when those financial assurances are required, a timeline for installing those public improvements, and then a process for releasing funds back to whoever submitted them to us. We are also looking at reworking the process for cash in lieu for parkland and open space land dedications. Right now, we are not proposing the ratio for how much land needs to be dedicated for parks or open space or schools. That's all remaining the same. Really, we're just proposing an adjustment to the cash in lieu option. So if the Parks and Recreation, Parab and OSAC, if they were to say, okay, we don't need land here, just do cash in lieu, we are proposing to move away from the formula that's in the existing code that would determine how much money is required for a certain amount of land to something that is instead in the annually updated universal fee schedule. What we've realized is that the existing formula doesn't really take into account changes in the market. And so with the universal fee schedule that is adopted by City Council, we have the ability to respond to specific market conditions and get a cash in lieu dedication that better reflects what the land value would be at the time that it would have been dedicated to us. Next chapter, so second to last here, we are looking at application procedures. So something that's kind of, again, this is going to sound a little planning nerdy, but something on the cutting edge of city planning is that there is a table that outlines application procedures instead of a list, which is kind of how our current code reads. So right at the top of this chapter, we have every single application type and all the steps that that application type needs to go through in order to get to a decision. So that would include, we'll just say rezoning, for example. That would say, okay, you have to do an initial application notice. So when we get the application in, we would do public notice, have a certain public comment period. We would have to go through a review period, which would be a checkbox. We would go through a public notice for a public hearing at the City Planning Commission level, again, another checkbox. And then at the City Council level, 2 hearings, more checkboxes. And then further down in that section, we outline the specifics of what each step entails. So we would have a whole section that's dedicated to what public notice is required and when, what the review process has to entail in general timelines for those review process or review timeframes, and so on down the line. We are also proposing new application types. So we are proposing the short-term rental permit, which we've talked about, a temporary use permit, which we are still talking about. So that one is in flux a little bit. We are proposing a minor site plan and a hillside minor site plan. Again, we're still talking about those, a boundary adjustment, as well as a waiver of replat. And we are proposing to remove the minor conditional use application type. So that minor conditional use application type is pretty much only used for short-term rental approvals. So if we go forward with a short-term rental permit, there's no use for this minor conditional use. So there would no longer be minor conditional use and major conditional use. It would just be a regular conditional use application. With that, do we have, or next is very simple. Every term that you could ever want defined is defined in the next chapter. Throughout the document, we would be italicizing every term that's defined. So as you're reading through the document, this improves the usability of the whole document as a whole. As you're reading through different sections and you come across one that's italicized, you can easily reference it in the in chapter 7 and know specifically what we're trying to describe wherever you're looking at in the code. Before I move on to current status, were there any questions or concerns regarding those last few chapters and generally where we're hoping to go with those? All right, great. So currently, like I mentioned, as of very early this morning, that draft code is with the code committee. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we as staff are taking a break. We are still working with our consultant, Logan Simpson, to produce checklists. And as you review chapter 6 specifically, we reference these checklists as being a mandatory document that the city has to maintain. And these checklists identify everything that is required for a complete application. So if you're looking at a major subdivision, you have to provide X, Y, and Z in order for us to start a review of your major subdivision. And our hope is that we get a more complete proposal upfront so that we can move it through the review process quicker. And if a city planning commission meeting is required, that you're getting applications that are complete and have been reviewed so that we're not having a very long, lengthy list of potential conditions that are saying, well, the applicant needs to provide us X, Y, and Z still. So this is how we're proposing to cease that from happening. So who's on this code committee that I keep talking about? We have Natalie Johnson with the City Council, Chair Delwich, Gloria's on this, or Commissioner Ladmer's on this code committee, Andy Wells, Farley, Rachel Bueller, Darlene Kennedy, Pat, Rich, and Conrad. And Conrad recently took a job with University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, so he has stepped away from the committee, but it was after we had worked our way through the sustainability initiative, so his influence is still definitely in the code. So what's next? Well, the language is with the code committee, so I am anticipating revisions after their review. And so we will have a period where we talk through those revisions and make any edits that we need. Then we will start a public outreach process where there will be a period for the public to review as well as open houses. And we're going to kind of glom on to other public events so that people aren't taking more time out of their day to talk about zoning. They're already going to something fun and hey, why not talk about zoning while you're here? And so that's how we're proposing to tackle public outreach. We'll also have an online platform where people can submit comments or questions, and then we can respond directly to them. From there, we will make any revisions that are necessary that may have come out of the public review, and then propose it to the City Planning Commission. And again, our goal is to get that document to the City Planning Commission 3 weeks in advance of the hearing. From there, we may need to make any revisions based on the City Planning Commission hearing. Then we would take it forward to the City Council for a work session in 2 hearings. And we're anticipating adoption and completion at the end of 2022. And if something happens to take a little bit longer, early 2023. And we've kind of talked about questions and comments as we've gone along, but I'm here if you have any others.
Thank you. I thought that was a great job.
Can I just two more things, please? Back on the 25% for affordable housing. I still think that's kind of high, and I just want to throw it out there. For example, just some quick math. If back in the example of 10, if somebody had 10 units, So then they give out 2 at a reduced price. So let's say that the 10 or the 8 are $2,000 a month. And I don't know what an American medium income is, but just as an example, you have 2 for $500 a month, right? So everything's 2,000, you got 2 for 500. That's $1,500 a month of lost rent, or times 2, or $3,000 a month, $36,000 a year. And over 10 years, that's $360,000 of lost income. That could be enough to make somebody build 200 yards east on the other side of the arch, and not in Manitou. I just think that's high. And then finally, I promise, on the signs, the city of Manitou Springs is obsessed with signs. I encourage you, next time you're driving around, now that we've talked about it, just look at the amount of signs that are everywhere. I would just, it would be nice if somebody just tried to reduce the signs from the city. And with that.
Okay, then I guess we are done. That was great. You'll get lots of time. Lots more time. Well, this is just very draft.
If you want to.
Yeah, we should talk about it.